Esperanza had exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes from the moment her phone alarm vibrated until she needed to be back in the kitchen. 3 minutes to dash across the hall, quietly open the utility closet door, make sure Valentina was okay, plant a kiss on her forehead, and slip back as if nothing had happened. If Mr. Johnson, her boss, caught her, she'd lose the only job that allowed her to care for her niece, and without that job, Valentina would end up in a state-run care facility, where nobody would know what to do when the seizures came, every 3 hours, like clockwork. For the past 2 years, that was Esperanza's secret routine, a routine that could cost her everything, but one she had no choice but to maintain, because Valentina was the only thing she had left of her sister Lucy, and Esperanza had sworn to protect her with her life. But to understand why Esperanza risked everything, every day, you first need to know the whole story. And I'm warning you, this story will make you feel outrage, it'll make you question everything, and in the end, it will show you something you never expected. 14 years ago, Esperanza received the call that changed her life forever. Her younger sister Lucy had died during childbirth. She was 22 years old, young, healthy, full of life. The pregnancy had been normal. Nobody expected complications. But sometimes, life doesn't give you a warning. Sometimes, it just takes what you love most, without explanation. Lucy died, but her daughter survived. A tiny, fragile baby, with her mother's dark eyes and a cry that seemed to be searching for her. They named her Valentina, and from the first moment, Esperanza knew that this little girl was her responsibility. There was no father. The man who got Lucy pregnant disappeared when he heard the news. They never found him. They never even looked. There were no grandparents. Esperanza and Lucy's parents had died years earlier in a car accident. There was only Esperanza, a single woman, 30 years old, who worked cleaning houses. No college education, no savings, no husband, no support system, but with an infinite love for this little girl, who was all that remained of her sister, and so began her life as a mother. Not a biological mother, but a mother in every way that mattered. She changed diapers, woke up at midnight, cried from frustration and from love, learned to do the impossible with the little she had. And for 3 years, everything was okay. Valentina was a normal child. Laughter, first steps, first words, the classic magic of watching a human being grow. But when Valentina turned 3, something changed. It was a Sunday morning. Esperanza was making breakfast when she heard a strange noise in the living room. She ran to see, and found Valentina on the floor. Her small body was shaking violently. Her eyes were blank. Foam was coming from her mouth. Esperanza didn't know what to do. She screamed. She cried. She called 911 with trembling hands. The ambulance took 15 minutes. That felt like 15 years. And when they finally arrived at the hospital, the doctors gave her the diagnosis that would change everything: epilepsy. A word that Esperanza had heard, but never understood. Until that day. The doctors patiently explained what it meant. Valentina's brain had abnormal electrical activity. Sometimes, that activity would fire out of control, causing seizures. They could be smaller, almost imperceptible, or they could be violent, lasting several minutes. They could happen once a month, or several times a day, and in Valentina's case, they were frequent and unpredictable. There's something that many people don't understand about epilepsy. It's not just a disease, it's a way of life. It's waking up every day, not knowing if today will be a good day or a bad day. It's planning everything around the possibility of a seizure. It's always carrying medication in your purse. It's avoiding bright lights and screens for too long. It's getting enough sleep, because exhaustion can trigger a crisis. It's living with constant fear. And it's not just the person with epilepsy who lives with that fear. Their family lives with it too. Esperanza learned all of this in the first few months after the diagnosis. She learned that there are different types of seizures. Some are barely noticeable, like the person is staring into space for a few seconds. Others are violent, with the whole body shaking. She learned that medications can control seizures in many cases, but not all cases. She learned that there are things that can trigger a crisis: stress, lack of sleep, flashing lights, certain foods, even hormonal changes. And she learned that, despite all the advances in medicine, epilepsy remains a mysterious disease in many ways. But that wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing came later, when the treatment started to fail. First, it was one medication. It worked for a few months, and then it stopped working. Then another, the same result, and another, and another, and another. 6 different medications in 5 years. None of them managed to control the seizures. Refractory epilepsy. That was the medical term for when medications don't work. It meant that Valentina would have seizures for the rest of her life. It meant that she could never be left alone. It meant that every day was a Russian roulette, not knowing when the next crisis would come. And it meant that Esperanza would have to find a way to take care of her, no matter what it cost. But there was something else that Esperanza had to face. Something that nobody talks about: the stigma. Epilepsy is one of the most misunderstood diseases in the world. Throughout history, people with epilepsy have been considered possessed by demons, punished by gods, cursed. Even today, in the 21st century, there are people who believe that epilepsy is contagious, that you can catch it if you touch someone during a seizure. Esperanza had seen that firsthand. When Valentina was 6 years old, she took her to a park near their house. They were playing quietly. When a seizure started, Esperanza did what she always did. She knelt next to Valentina. She turned her on her side. She protected her head. And she waited. But as she waited, she heard the whispers. The mothers of other children were watching with horror. They were pulling their children away from the area where Valentina was convulsing, as if she had a contagious disease, as if she were dangerous. When the seizure ended, Esperanza looked up and saw that the park was empty. Everyone had left. Nobody had come to ask if she needed help. Nobody had offered to call 911. Only looks of fear, of disgust, of rejection. That day, Esperanza cried on the bus home, not because of the seizure. She was used to those by now. She cried for the world, for a world that still didn't understand that epilepsy isn't a choice. It's not something you can prevent. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's simply a neurological condition, and nothing more, nothing less. But society didn't see it that way, and Esperanza had to learn. To protect Valentina not just from the seizures themselves, but also from the ignorance of others. That's why, when she started working for the Carters, she didn't tell anyone about Valentina, not because she was ashamed of her niece, but because she'd seen how people reacted too many times, and she didn't want to see that look of fear in her boss's eyes. She didn't want them to treat her differently. She didn't want them to see her as a burden, so she hid the truth and carried the secret alone for 5 years. If this video is making you think about someone you know, someone who's struggling every day without anyone knowing, stick around until the end, because what you're about to discover will change the way you see things. Esperanza needed a job, not just any job, a job that would allow her to care for Valentina at the same time. But what kind of job allows for that? Factory work didn't, retail didn't, office jobs definitely didn't. Esperanza searched for months, and finally, she found something that might work: house cleaning. Cleaning the homes of wealthy families. The hours were flexible, the tasks were familiar, and most importantly, some families would allow her to bring Valentina with her while she worked, but finding those families wasn't easy. Esperanza remembers every rejection, every door that was slammed in her face, every time she was told that they couldn't accept an employee with a sick child. The first house where she worked after Valentina's diagnosis was with a middle-class family. They were nice at first. They said it was no problem to bring the girl, but the first time Valentina had a seizure in their house, everything changed. The lady of the house ran screaming from the room. "What's wrong with the child? Is she possessed?" Esperanza had to explain that it was epilepsy, that it wasn't dangerous and that it wasn't contagious. But the lady wouldn't let her finish. "Look, I understand you're in a tough spot, but I can't have that in my house. I have children. I don't want them to see that." Esperanza was fired that very day, without pay, without notice, without compassion. The second house was worse. The family hired her knowing about Valentina, or so she thought. But when the mother of the house discovered that Valentina had seizures, she called Esperanza into her office. "You didn't tell me the girl had attacks." Esperanza explained that she had mentioned that Valentina had epilepsy in the interview. "Yes, but you didn't say she had attacks. That's different. I can't have that responsibility in my house. What if she gets hurt? We could be sued." Again, fired. The third house was different. It was an older family, an elderly couple who lived alone. And when they saw Valentina, instead of fear, they showed compassion. The grandmother had had a brother with epilepsy. She knew what it was like. And for 3 years, Esperanza worked in that house without any problems. Valentina had a special corner where she played. The grandmother gave her cookies. The grandfather told her stories. It was almost like having a family. But then the elderly couple passed away. One first, the other 3 months later. And Esperanza had to find work again. Those were difficult months. Rejections, discrimination, fear. Until she finally found the Carter's ad. They were looking for a housekeeper, full-time, good salary. And when Esperanza went to the interview, she didn't mention Valentina. Not because she wanted to lie, but because she couldn't bear another rejection. Esperanza worked in several houses for years. Some families were kind, others were indifferent, but all of them tolerated Valentina being there, playing in some corner while her aunt cleaned, until she came to the Carter's house to Mr. Johnson Carter owned a chain of restaurants, a successful businessman, a millionaire, known for his seriousness and his obsession with efficiency. His wife, Claudia, was what people called a socialite. She organized charity events, appeared in magazines, and had a closet bigger than Esperanza's apartment. When Esperanza was hired 5 years ago, she was told the rules. Absolute punctuality, total discretion, and the most important rule of all, no bringing family members to work. Esperanza asked why. The answer was vague. Something about an incident with another employee. Something about keeping the house professional. Esperanza didn't push it. At that time, Valentina was 9 years old and could stay at a neighbor's house during working hours. It was complicated, but it worked. But 2 years ago, everything changed. The neighbor who took care of Valentina moved to another city, and there was no one else. Esperanza searched desperately for options. She called everyone she knew, asked at the church, searched online, visited daycare centers. But the answers were always the same. A professional nanny cost more than she made in a month. A special school for children with epilepsy cost twice as much. A daycare center wouldn't accept children with frequent seizures. The risk was too high. They said they didn't have trained personnel. Esperanza was trapped. If she quit her job, she wouldn't have money to live on. If she brought Valentina to work, she would be fired. If she left Valentina alone, something terrible could happen. 3 impossible choices, and she had to choose the least bad one. The first day was the most terrifying of her life. Esperanza arrived early, very early, before anyone else arrived. She carried Valentina asleep in her arms. She took her to the utility closet in the back of the house. It was a small space, barely enough to store brooms, mops, hand cleaning supplies. But it had a door that could be locked, and it had an outlet to charge her phone, and it had silence. Esperanza settled Valentina in a corner. She gave her a pillow, a blanket, her favorite doll. She kissed her forehead and closed the door with her heart in her throat. For the next 8 hours, Esperanza worked as if nothing was happening. She cleaned floors, washed dishes, dusted furniture, ironed clothes, and every 3 hours, when no one was watching, she ran to the utility closet to check that Valentina was okay. The first time, Valentina was asleep. The second time, she was awake but calm, reading a book that Esperanza had left for her. The third time, she was drawing in a notebook. At the end of the day, Esperanza snuck Valentina out the back door. They walked to the bus stop and made it home. Nobody had noticed. And so began the secret routine that would last 2 years. Every day, Esperanza arrived before everyone else. Every day, she hid Valentina in the utility closet. Every day, she left her food, water, books, notebooks, and a charged cell phone just in case. And every 3 hours, without fail, she rushed to check on her. Sometimes Valentina would have seizures. And when that happened, Esperanza dropped everything and ran. It didn't matter if she was in the middle of cleaning Mr. Johnson's bathroom. It didn't matter if Mrs. Davis had asked her for something urgent. Nothing mattered except getting to that utility closet. Before anyone heard the noises, Esperanza had learned how to manage Valentina's seizures. After 11 years of practice, she knew exactly what to do. Turn her on her side, so she wouldn't choke. Protect her head from bumps. Not put anything in her mouth. Despite what people say, talk to her calmly, even if she couldn't hear. And wait. Wait for it to pass, because the seizures always pass. Sometimes they last 30 seconds, sometimes 2 minutes, sometimes 5. If they went over 5 minutes, Esperanza knew it was an emergency, and she had to call an ambulance. But in 2 years, that had only happened once. And that day. Esperanza almost lost everything, but that's another part of the story. Now let me tell you about the items Esperanza used to keep Valentina safe, because not just anyone can care for someone with epilepsy, and Esperanza had learned things that no book teaches. The first item was a medical bracelet. It wasn't a bracelet bought at a pharmacy. It was a handmade bracelet by Esperanza, a braided leather cord with a metal plate, where she had engraved the most important information. Name, Valentina Rojas. Condition, refractory epilepsy. Emergency contact, Esperanza Rojas. Allergies, none. Medications, levetiracetam, 500 mg. If something happened, and Esperanza wasn't nearby, that bracelet could save Valentina's life. The second item was a special mat. Esperanza had sewn it herself. It was a thin mat, but with several layers of foam, enough to cushion the impact if Valentina fell during a seizure. Because seizures don't give warnings. They can happen while you're standing, while you're walking, while you're eating. And if you fall to the ground without protection, you can do a lot of damage. Valentina had scars on her forehead from previous falls. Esperanza didn't want that to happen again. That's why, every day, the first thing she did was unfold that mat in the utility closet, so that if a seizure came, Valentina would have somewhere to fall. Every time the 3-hour alarm went off, Esperanza dropped what she was doing. Sometimes she was in the middle of ironing, sometimes cleaning the guest bathroom, sometimes in the kitchen. It didn't matter. She left everything and walked calmly, feigning tranquility, towards the utility closet. She opened the door, verified that Valentina was okay, and in less than 3 minutes, she was back at her post, as if nothing had happened. Nobody suspected anything, or so Esperanza thought. One day, about 1.5 years ago, Esperanza was almost discovered. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Mr. Johnson had arrived home early from work, something that almost never happened. Normally, Mr. Johnson arrived after 7, but that day he arrived at 4. Esperanza was in the kitchen when she heard the front door open. Her heart raced, because right at that moment, her 3-hour alarm was about to go off, and she couldn't skip the check. Valentina had been alone for over 2 hours. Esperanza heard Mr. Johnson's footsteps approaching. First, he went to the living room, then to the study, then to the hallway that led to the utility closet. Esperanza stopped what she was doing and left the kitchen. She needed to distract him. "Mr. Johnson, it's good you're home. Can I fix you something to eat?" Mr. Johnson looked at her with those cold eyes he always had. "No, thank you. I'm going to check on some things in the storage room." The storage room was next to the utility closet. Esperanza felt the world stopping. At that moment, she heard something. A small noise, almost imperceptible. It was coming from the utility closet. It was Valentina coughing. Esperanza spoke louder than normal, trying to cover up the noise. "Mr. Johnson, I think there's a problem with the faucet in the guest bathroom. I've been adding water, but it's still dripping." Mr. Johnson frowned. "Why didn't you call the plumber?" Esperanza improvised. "Well, I thought maybe it wasn't that serious, but if you want, I'll show you." Mr. Johnson looked at her for a few seconds, seconds that felt like hours. And finally, he said, "Fine, show me." Esperanza walked towards the guest bathroom, leading Mr. Johnson away from the hallway. As they walked, she heard another noise from the utility closet, this time louder. But Mr. Johnson didn't seem to have noticed it, or if he did notice it, he didn't say anything. Esperanza showed him the faucet in the bathroom, invented a problem that didn't exist, and managed to keep him occupied long enough for Valentina to calm down. That night, when she got home, Esperanza cried for an hour. She cried from fear, from relief, from exhaustion. And she wondered how much longer she could keep doing this. But she had no choice. She had to keep going. For Valentina. Now, let me tell you about the third item that Esperanza used to care for her niece. It was a pink timer, a kitchen timer, the kind used for baking. But Esperanza didn't use it for cooking. She used it to measure Valentina's seizures. Because there was a rule that all caregivers of people with epilepsy know: if a seizure lasts more than 5 minutes, it's a medical emergency. It's called status epilepticus, and it can cause brain damage or even death. Esperanza knew that, and every time Valentina had a seizure, the first thing she did was start the timer. 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes. Esperanza counted, while holding Valentina on her side, protecting her head, and speaking calmly. "It's going to pass, my love. It's almost over. Auntie's here with you." 3 minutes, 4 minutes. If it reached 4.5 minutes, Esperanza started to mentally prepare to call emergency services, but almost always. The seizures ended sooner, 3 minutes. That was the average. And when they were over, came the hardest part. The post-ictal confusion. After a seizure, the brain is exhausted. The person doesn't know where they are. They don't recognize anyone. Sometimes they can't even speak. Valentina sometimes cried during this phase. Sometimes she just stared blankly ahead. Sometimes she'd ask for her mum, for Lucy. And every time that happened, Esperanza's heart broke a little more. Because she couldn't bring Lucy back. She could only be there, holding Valentina, waiting for the confusion to pass. Those were the longest hours. The hours when Esperanza wondered if she was doing the right thing, if hiding her niece in a utility closet was the solution, if there was another way. But she never found answers, just more questions. If you want to know more about epilepsy and how it affects families, leave me a comment, because there are millions of people living with this condition and very few talk about it. Now, the fourth object, the most important of all. It was a journal, a spiral notebook with a pink plastic cover. Valentina had picked it out herself when Esperanza told her they needed to keep track of the seizures. "I'm 14, Auntie. I'm not using a boring notebook." So she chose a pink one with unicorn stickers. And every time Valentina had a seizure, Esperanza wrote everything down. Date, time, duration, type of movements, how she felt before, how she felt after. It was a handmade medical record, without the coldness of hospitals, without the technical language of doctors, just the observations of a woman who knew her niece better than anyone. That journal had over 200 entries, 200 seizures in 2 years, some brief and some long, some violent and some gentle, but all documented. Because Esperanza knew the doctors needed that information, and because writing it down helped her process it, it was her way of maintaining control in a situation where she had control of nothing. One day, Valentina asked her something that made her cry. "Auntie, why do we have to hide? Is it because I'm sick?" Esperanza looked at her. Valentina was 14, but sometimes she seemed much older. The illness had aged her before her time. "No, honey, it's not because you're sick." "Then why?" Esperanza took a breath. "Because Mr. Johnson has rules, and one of his rules is that employees can't bring their families." "But why?" "I don't know, honey. Some people have rules that don't make sense. What if they find me?" Esperanza hugged her tightly. "If they find you, we'll find another job. But don't worry about that. I'll take care of you. I'll always take care of you." Valentina nodded, but Esperanza could see in her eyes that she wasn't reassured. That she knew they were doing something they shouldn't, and that despite being only 14, she was carrying a guilt that wasn't hers to bear. That night, Esperanza made herself a promise. If they were ever discovered, she wouldn't let Valentina carry the blame. It was all her decision, all her responsibility. Valentina was just a child who needed care, and Esperanza was the adult who had chosen to risk everything to give it to her. Now, let me tell you why Mr. Johnson had prohibited employees from bringing family members, because that rule hadn't always existed. It had started 8 years ago, after an incident. Esperanza didn't know all the details, just rumors she'd heard from other employees. But this is what she knew. 8 years ago, a driver who worked for the Johnsons brought his son to work. The boy was about 10 years old, and while the driver was doing his tasks, the boy was left alone in the garage. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but the boy found the keys to one of the cars. A Ferrari. A really expensive one. And he decided it would be a good idea to sit in the driver's seat. Somehow, the boy managed to start the car and crashed it into the garage wall. The boy was unharmed. Miraculously, but the Ferrari was destroyed, and Mr. Johnson lost more than just a car that day. He lost trust. He fired the driver immediately, and the next day, he sent a memo to all the employees. No family members allowed at work. No exceptions. That was the rule that Esperanza had been breaking for 2 years, not out of whim, not out of irresponsibility, but because she had no other option. But rules are rules, and Mr. Johnson wasn't known for his flexibility. Esperanza knew it, and every day. She lived with the fear of being discovered. There were other employees in the house, and a gardener, a cook, a butler. None of them knew Esperanza's secret, or so she thought. But there was someone who had started to notice strange things. Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Johnson's wife. Claudia wasn't like her husband. Where Mr. Johnson was cold, she was warm. Where Mr. Johnson was strict, she was flexible. Where Mr. Johnson saw employees, she saw people. And Claudia had noticed something about Esperanza. She'd noticed how she disappeared every 3 hours for a few minutes. She'd noticed how she sometimes seemed nervous for no apparent reason. She'd noticed how she always arrived very early and left very late. At first, Claudia thought maybe Esperanza was stealing something. It was the most logical explanation for her strange behavior, but after observing her for weeks, Claudia dismissed that theory. Esperanza was honest. Of that she was sure. So what was she hiding? Claudia decided to find out. And what she discovered would change everything. It was a Thursday morning. Claudia had returned early from a charity meeting. Normally, she arrived after 2. But that day, the meeting was cancelled at the last minute. Claudia entered the house silently, not because she wanted to spy on anyone, simply because that's how she was. Silent, observant. She walked towards her bedroom, but on the way, she heard something. A strange noise coming from the back hallway, where the utility closet was located. Claudia stopped. The noise was like a moan, low, repetitive. She thought maybe some animal had gotten into the house, or that there was a problem with the pipes. She walked towards the utility closet and opened the door. What she saw left her paralyzed. On the floor of the small closet, a teenage girl was having a seizure. Her body was shaking violently. Her eyes were blank. Foam was coming from her mouth. And kneeling beside her, holding her carefully, was Esperanza, the cleaning lady who had been working in her house for 5 years. Esperanza saw Claudia standing in the doorway, and her whole world crumbled. But she couldn't stop. Valentina was in the middle of a seizure, and seizures don't wait. Esperanza kept doing what she knew how to do. She kept Valentina on her side, protected her head with one hand, and glanced at the pink timer she kept nearby. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Almost over, honey. Almost over. Claudia stood frozen in the doorway, unsure what to do. She'd never seen a seizure up close before. It was terrifying. That girl's body moved in ways that didn't seem human. The sounds coming from her throat were guttural, primitive, and Esperanza's expression was one of a calm that seemed impossible in this situation. 3 minutes, 15 seconds. The seizure began to subside. The movements became less violent, her breathing normalized, and finally Valentina lay still, exhausted, confused, but alive. Esperanza held her close. "It's over, sweetie. It's over. Auntie's here." And then she looked at Claudia. There were tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Claudia, which I can explain." But Claudia shook her head. She knelt down next to Esperanza, and in a soft voice that surprised even herself, she said, "Take care of the girl first. We'll talk later." And she waited. She waited while Esperanza gave Valentina water, waited while the post-ictal confusion passed, waited while Valentina finally recognized her aunt and asked what had happened. And when everything calmed down, Claudia did something Esperanza didn't expect. She offered her a hand to help her up. "Come on, let's talk in the kitchen." Esperanza followed Claudia, her legs trembling. She was sure she was going to be fired. 2 years of secrets, 2 years of breaking the rules, 2 years of lies. It was all over. In the kitchen, Claudia poured her a glass of water. Esperanza couldn't drink it. Her hands were shaking too much. "What's her name?" "Valentina. She's my niece. And she has epilepsy." "Yes, ma'am. Since she was 3. Claudia nodded slowly. "How long have you been bringing her here?" Esperanza looked down. 2 years. 2 years. Claudia repeated the words, not with anger, with something closer to astonishment. "You've been taking care of a little girl with severe epilepsy in a utility closet for 2 years, and no one noticed." Esperanza said nothing. What else could she say? "Why didn't you ask for help?" The tears started to fall. "Because Mr. Johnson forbids bringing family members, and I don't have anyone else who can take care of her. If I leave her alone, she could die. The seizures are unpredictable, and if I lose this job, I won't be able to pay for her medication." Esperanza was openly weeping now. All the fear, the tension, the exhaustion of 2 years finally pouring out. "I know I broke the rules. I know I deserve to be fired. But please, ma'am, soon let me finish the week. I need to find another job before I go. For Valentina, please." Claudia watched her in silence. and Esperanza could see something in her eyes that she hadn't expected. It wasn't anger. It wasn't judgment. It was something else. Something that looked like compassion. Esperanza, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer me honestly. Esperanza nodded. Are you doing this and because you love that little girl? Esperanza looked her in the eye. She's the only thing I have in the world. She's the daughter I never had. She's all that's left of my sister. I love her more than my own life. Claudia nodded, and then she said something Esperanza would remember for the rest of her life. I'm not going to tell Mr. Johnson. Esperanza wasn't sure she'd heard right. What? I'm not going to tell him. At least, not yet. But we need to find a better solution than a utility closet. Esperanza couldn't believe what she was hearing. Why are you helping me? Claudia sighed. Because I know what it's like to love someone who's sick. I know what it's like to feel like you can't do anything. And I know what it's like to hide, out of fear. Esperanza looked at her, confused. Claudia had never talked about anything personal with her. But before she could ask, Claudia stood up. Bring Valentina to the guest room on the second floor. It has its own bathroom and a comfortable bed. She'll be better off there than in that utility closet. Esperanza couldn't move. She was in shock. Ma'am, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just take care of your niece. I'll handle Mr. Johnson. And she left, leaving Esperanza in the kitchen, crying. But this time, crying with relief. During the following weeks, Valentina stopped hiding in the utility closet. Now she had a real room, a comfortable bed, a private bathroom, a window with a view of the garden, and Claudia made sure that no one entered that room when Mr. Johnson was home. It was a shared secret, Esperanza and Claudia. Two women who had nothing in common, a cleaning lady and a wealthy socialite, but united by something more powerful than money or social class. United by the love for someone vulnerable. Claudia visited Valentina almost every day. She brought her books, lent her tablet to watch movies, kept her company when Esperanza was busy, and Valentina, who had lived so isolated, finally had someone besides her aunt, someone who treated her like a normal person, not like a sick person, not like a problem. Just like a 14-year-old girl who deserved attention and affection. But everything comes to an end, and Esperanza's secret was about to come to light, in the worst way possible. Now, I'm going to tell you something you are going to want to share. It was a Saturday morning. Mr. Johnson had decided to stay home that day, something rare. Normally on Saturdays he went to the golf club, or to business meetings, but that day, he stayed home and decided to do something he almost never did. Wander around his own house. Claudia was at a charity event. The staff was doing their usual chores, and Mr. Johnson, bored, decided to explore the rooms on the second floor. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just walking, until he reached the door of the guest room, and he heard something. A voice, a young voice. Someone was talking inside that room. Mr. Johnson frowned. Who could be in there? He opened the door, and what he saw left him completely speechless. There was a teenage girl sitting on the bed, a teenage girl he'd never seen in his life, and at that moment, right at that moment, the girl began to tremble. Her eyes rolled back, her body convulsed, and she began to fall. Mr. Johnson stood frozen. She didn't know what to do. She didn't understand what was happening. And in that moment, Esperanza came running in. She rushed past Mr. Johnson without even looking at him. She lunged towards the bed and caught Valentina before she fell to the floor. It's okay, honey. It's okay. It's over now. Auntie's here. Mr. Johnson stared at the scene, unable to move. The housekeeper was kneeling on the bed, holding a child who was convulsing, and she was doing it with a calm, an experience that could only come from years of practice. The pink timer appeared from somewhere. Esperanza started it while keeping Valentina on her side. 1 minute. 2 minutes. It's almost over, sweetie. Almost over. Mr. Johnson remained frozen in the doorway. Finally, He found his voice. "What in the world is going on here?" Esperanza didn't answer him. She couldn't. Valentina was her priority. 3 minutes. The convulsion began to subside. And when it finally ended, Esperanza looked up at Mr. Johnson. Her eyes were filled with tears, but also something else. Defiance. "If you're going to fire me, do it. But first, let me make sure my niece is okay." Mr. Johnson said nothing. He just kept staring at the exhausted child on the bed, staring at the housekeeper who had broken all his rules, staring at something he didn't understand. But that seemed familiar. Too familiar. Mr. Johnson took a step back, and then another, and then he left, without saying a word. But what Esperanza didn't see was what happened next. Mr. Johnson walked to his study, closed the door, and sat down in his leather armchair, alone, in silence, staring into nothing, because what he had seen in that room wasn't just a child convulsing. It was his brother, Michael. It was his backyard 45 years ago. It was the moment he had spent his entire life trying to forget. Mr. Johnson closed his eyes, and the memories came flooding back like an avalanche. Michael was 8 years old. He was 10. It was a Saturday afternoon. Their parents were inside preparing dinner. They were playing catch in the yard, and everything was normal until it wasn't. Michael stopped moving. His eyes rolled back, and he started to shake. 10-year-old Robert didn't know what to do. He had seen his brother's seizures before, but there was always an adult nearby. There was always someone who knew what to do. But that day, he was alone, and he panicked. Instead of staying with Michael, he ran to get his parents. He ran as fast as he could, screaming, crying, terrified. His parents came running out after him, but by the time they reached the yard, Michael had already fallen. He had hit his head on a rock lining the garden. There was blood, so much blood. They rushed him to the emergency room. The doctors did everything they could. But 2 days later, Michael died. Traumatic brain injury. That's what the doctors said. A blow to the head, during a seizure, because nobody was there to protect him, because Robert, his older brother, didn't stay. Mr. Johnson opened his eyes. Tears were streaming down his face. 45 years later, the pain was just as fresh. The guilt was just as heavy. And today, he had seen a housekeeper do what he couldn't. He had seen Esperanza stay. He had seen Esperanza protect her niece's head. He had seen Esperanza be everything he wasn't, and something in him broke, not in a bad way, in the way things need to break in order to be rebuilt. Mr. Johnson spent the entire night in his study, thinking, remembering, and finally, understanding something he had avoided his whole life. The rule about not bringing family members wasn't to protect his house. It was to protect himself from the memories, from the pain, from the guilt. But that night, watching Esperanza care for Valentina, Mr. Johnson understood something else. Hiding from the pain didn't make it disappear. It only made it stronger, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to face it. When the sun rose the next morning, Mr. Johnson had already made a decision. Esperanza saw him walking down the hallway, and she knew it was the end. She was going to be fired. After 5 years of impeccable work, after 2 years of secrets, after everything. Esperanza hugged Valentina. Tears were falling down her cheeks. "Forgive me, sweetie. I tried. I really tried." Valentina, still confused from the seizure, didn't understand what was happening, but she felt her aunt's sadness and hugged her tighter. That night, Esperanza couldn't sleep. She expected a call from Mr. Johnson telling her not to come back, or a message from Claudia apologizing for not being able to help anymore. But nothing came. Only silence. A silence that was worse than any condemnation. The next morning, Esperanza went to work as usual. If she was going to be fired, she preferred it to be in person. She wanted to look Mr. Johnson in the eye and tell him everything she had sacrificed, everything she had risked, everything she had done for love. But when she arrived at the mansion, something strange happened. Claudia was waiting for her at the door, and next to her was Mr. Johnson. Esperanza braced herself for the worst, but Mr. Johnson didn't look angry. He looked different. He looked older than he had yesterday. He looked like he was carrying something heavy. "Esperanza," Mr. Johnson said. His voice was different, softer. "We need to talk." Esperanza nodded. She sat down in the living room, across from Mr. Johnson and Claudia, and waited. Mr. Johnson took a breath. "What I'm about to tell you, almost no one knows, not even most of my employees." Esperanza said nothing. "When I was 10 years old, I had a younger brother. His name was Michael. He was 8 years old." Esperanza looked at him, confused. What did this have to do with her? Michael had epilepsy. Esperanza's heart stopped. "It wasn't as severe as your niece's, but he had seizures regularly." Mr. Johnson paused. His eyes were moist. "One day, we were playing in our backyard. My parents were inside. It was just him and me." Mr. Johnson closed his eyes. "He started having a seizure. I was 10 years old. I didn't know what to do. I panicked. Instead of staying with him, I ran to get my parents." A tear fell down Mr. Johnson's cheek. "By the time we got back, Michael had fallen and hit his head on a rock." Esperanza covered her mouth with her hand. "He died 2 days later in the hospital." The silence in the room was absolute. Mr. Johnson opened his eyes. "I was 10 years old. I was a kid. It wasn't my fault. That's what I've been told my whole life. But I knew the truth. If I had stayed with him, if I had protected his head like you did yesterday with your niece, maybe he'd still be alive." Esperanza didn't know what to say. The cold, strict man she'd known for 5 years was crying in front of her. When I saw that girl convulsing yesterday, it was like seeing him all over again. And when I saw you, so calm, so capable, doing everything I couldn't do. Mr. Johnson couldn't finish the sentence. Lucy took his hand. "What Mr. Johnson is trying to say is that he understands why you did what you did." Mr. Johnson nodded. "The rule about not bringing family. I made it because I was afraid that something would happen in my house and I wouldn't be able to handle it. Afraid of reliving what happened with Michael." He looked at Esperanza directly. "It wasn't to punish anyone, it was to protect myself." Esperanza finally found her voice. "Mr. Johnson, I didn't know. I'm so sorry about your brother." Mr. Johnson shook his head. "You don't have to apologize. I'm the one who should be apologizing." He moved closer to her. "For 2 years, you hid your niece in a utility closet. 2 years caring for her in secret, afraid of getting caught. All because I made a stupid rule based on my own trauma. Esperanza, I'm asking for your forgiveness." Esperanza couldn't believe what she was hearing. The cold, strict millionaire was asking her for forgiveness. The housekeeper. But Mr. Johnson hadn't finished. "And I want to do something else." He took some documents from an envelope. "These are the papers to enroll Valentina in the best epilepsy clinic in the country. They have a program for children with refractory epilepsy, trials for new medications, surgical options, all paid for." Esperanza looked at him, uncomprehending. "What? What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to help, not out of obligation, not out of charity, because that girl deserves a chance, and because you deserve someone to help you after everything you've done alone." Tears streamed down Esperanza's face. She couldn't speak. Lucy came over and hugged her. "Besides," said Lucy, We already talked to the butler. Valentina has her own room now, officially. She can stay here while you work. No secrets, no fears. Esperanza sobbed into Lucy's shoulder. 20 years carrying everything alone. 14 years raising Valentina without help. 2 years hiding her niece in a utility closet. And finally, someone was reaching out their hand. Now, let me tell you where they are today. 6 months have passed since that conversation. Valentina still has epilepsy. The disease didn't disappear. The seizures are still happening, but they're less frequent. The specialized clinic found a new medication that seems to be working. The seizures went from 5 per week to 2 per week. And the doctors believe that, with more time, they can be reduced even further. Valentina is no longer hiding. She has a beautiful room in the Castaneda mansion, with a comfortable bed, books, a tablet, and a window overlooking the garden. And she has something she's never had before: friends. Lucy took her to meet other families with children who have epilepsy, and for the first time in her life, Valentina met other teenagers who understood what it was like to live with seizures, who understood the fear, the shame, and the isolation, and who made her feel less alone. Esperanza still works at the mansion, but no longer as a housekeeper. Mr. Johnson promoted her to house manager. She has a better salary, better benefits, and the freedom to organize her schedule to take care of Valentina when she needs it. It's not charity, Mr. Johnson told her. It's justice. You were doing the job of 3 people for 5 years and never complained. It's time someone recognized you. And Mr. Johnson, the cold, strict man changed. Not completely. He's still serious. He's still demanding. He's still a businessman. But something in him softened. Now he spends time with Valentina. He teaches her how to play chess. He tells her stories about his brother Michael. He shows her pictures from when they were children. It's his way of healing, his way of making peace with the past, his way of turning guilt into something useful. And Lucy? Lucy became something Esperanza never expected to have. A friend. The 2 women, so different in everything, found something in common: love for vulnerable people, and the willingness to do the impossible to protect them. A week ago, Valentina did something that no one expected. She was in the living room of the mansion, doing homework. Mr. Johnson and Lucy were reading on the sofa. Esperanza was in the kitchen. Everything was quiet. And then Valentina looked up from her books and said something. Mr. Johnson, thank you. Mr. Johnson looked at her, surprised. What are you thanking me for helping my aunt? And for helping me? I know you didn't have to do it, but you did. And that means a lot. Mr. Johnson didn't know what to say. He'd spent 45 years carrying the guilt of not having saved his brother. And now, a 14-year-old girl was thanking him for something, for doing what he couldn't do so many years ago. Mr. Johnson walked over to Valentina and gave her a hug. It wasn't a millionaire's hug. It wasn't a formal hug. It was the hug of a man who was finally healing. Esperanza, watching from the kitchen doorway, smiled. Tears streamed down her cheeks. But this time they were tears of happiness. Because after 20 years of struggling alone, she finally had a family. Not a family of blood, but a family of the heart. And that, in the end, is all that matters. There's something else I want to tell you. Something that happened 2 weeks ago. Esperanza received a letter. A letter from an organization supporting families with epilepsy. It turns out that Esperanza and Valentina's story had become known in the community. Not because she had told it, but because Lucy, without telling her, had written an article about them for the Foundation's magazine. The letter was an invitation. They wanted Esperanza to speak at their next conference. They wanted her to share her story with other families who were going through the same thing. Esperanza read the letter 3 times. She couldn't believe that anyone would want to hear her story, that anyone thought her years of struggle could help others. At first, she wanted to say no. I'm not anyone important. she told Lucy. "I'm just a housekeeper." Lucy looked at her with those eyes that Esperanza now knew well. "You're a woman who secretly cared for her niece for 2 years without anyone knowing. You're a woman who learned to manage seizures better than many doctors. You're a woman who loved someone so much that she risked everything for her." He paused. "That's not being a nobody. That's being a hero." Esperanza cried when she heard those words. No one had ever called her a hero. Not even she herself saw herself that way. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to start. Let me finish with something Esperanza told me the last time we spoke. I asked her how she felt after everything she had been through, and she told me something I will never forget. For years, I thought hiding Valentina was the worst thing I could do. I thought I was a liar, a bad person, someone who didn't deserve help. She paused. But now I understand that what I was doing wasn't lying. It was surviving. It was caring. It was loving in the only way I knew how. And then she added, "Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who carry burdens that no one sees. And sometimes, all they need is someone to tell them that they don't have to carry them alone." If you know someone who is secretly caring for a sick relative, if you know someone who is afraid to ask for help, if you know someone who is struggling alone, share this video with them. Not because it's going to solve all their problems, but because maybe, just maybe, it will remind them that they are not alone, that there are people in the world who understand, and that sometimes help comes from where you least expect it. In the pinned comment, I've left a question for you. Do you know someone who has had to hide something for fear of losing their job? Someone who cares in secret? Tell us their story, because every story deserves to be told, and every caregiver deserves to be seen. Thank you for staying until the end. If this video touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to see more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We'll see you in the next video, where we will continue to tell stories of extraordinary people. People who love unconditionally. People who care without expecting anything in return. People like Esperanza. And maybe, people like you.